I chose my wife over my parents. And the last time I saw my father, he was on his knees on a sidewalk in Ohio, begging strangers for change. And I pretended I didn't recognize him. I'm 38 years old now, and even after everything that happened, there are nights when sleep abandons me completely, and I lie there staring into the darkness, hearing my father's voice echoing in my mind. Not angry, not disappointed, just confused, the kind of quiet confusion that only comes from a man whose heart has been broken by his own son. And every time that memory returns, I'm forced to relive the exact moment my life began to fall apart, though at the time I convinced myself I was doing something noble, something necessary, because I truly believed I was protecting my future, my marriage, the life I thought I was supposed to build, and the center of that belief was Lauren. I met Lauren when I was 34, at a networking event in downtown Columbus, one of those polished corporate mixers where everyone pretends their life is already successful, even when they're barely holding it together. And from the moment she spoke to me, she had this confidence that made the rest of the room disappear. She was sharp, ambitious, fearless in a way that made my steady, predictable upbringing feel small by comparison, and when she laughed at my jokes or leaned closer when we talked, I felt something dangerous but intoxicating, the feeling that someone extraordinary had chosen me. I had grown up in a quiet suburb on the edge of Columbus, raised by two parents who worked harder than anyone I've ever known. My father spent 30 years working maintenance at a manufacturing plant, coming home every evening with grease on his hands and exhaustion in his shoulders, while my mother cleaned offices at night after raising me all day, and though they never complained, their entire lives were built around sacrifice. Every dollar saved, every comfort postponed, every dream quietly pushed aside so that I could have opportunities they never had. But when Lauren entered my life, she didn't see that sacrifice the way I once did. She saw it as limitation. At first it was subtle, little comments that sounded harmless if you didn't listen too closely. She would say things like, "Your parents mean well, but they think small," or "You're capable of so much more than the life they imagine for you." And because I loved her, because I wanted to believe she saw something bigger in me, I started listening. Slowly, almost without realizing it, I began to look at my parents through her eyes instead of my own. Our engagement happened quickly, within 8 months of meeting, and while I remember the excitement of that time, I also remember the first moment the tension between Lauren and my parents became impossible to ignore. It was during the engagement dinner at my parents' house, the same house they had spent decades paying off, the place where every wall carried some memory of my childhood, and Lauren arrived with a folder tucked neatly under her arm, smiling as if nothing unusual was about to happen. Halfway through dinner, she placed the folder on the table and explained, calmly, confidently, that she had been planning a business idea, a marketing agency that could grow quickly with the right initial investment, and that the bank was willing to approve a significant loan if we could provide collateral. I remember my mother's smile fading slightly as Lauren spoke, while my father listened carefully, nodding politely but growing quieter with every sentence. Then Lauren opened the folder and slid a stack of documents across the table. "It's just temporary," she said gently, almost reassuringly. "We only need the house listed as collateral until the company is profitable." My mother's hands immediately covered her mouth, while my father didn't even touch the papers at first. He simply looked at them as if they were written in another language. Finally, after a long silence, he said something that still echoes in my head today. "Son, maybe we should have a lawyer look at this first." It wasn't anger. It wasn't refusal. It was caution, the kind of careful thinking that had protected our family for decades. But Lauren squeezed my hand under the table, and later that night, when we were alone, she cried. She said my parents didn't trust her. She said they were trying to sabotage the life we were building together. She said if I truly believed in her, I would stand up for us. And the worst part is, I believed her. Completely. The next time I visited my parents, I didn't come as their son asking for help. I came as someone defending an argument that had already been decided in my mind. I told them Lauren felt disrespected. I told them they were holding me back. I even accused them of caring more about a house than about my future. My mother cried openly at the kitchen table while my father stayed silent for a long time, staring down at the worn wood surface like a man trying to understand how the conversation had turned into something so painful. Eventually he picked up the documents again and said quietly, "If this is what you want, son, we'll help." The day they signed those papers, I watched my father's hands tremble slightly as he wrote his name, but I convinced myself it was just nerves, that everything would work out once the business succeeded, that this was the kind of risk successful people took all the time. What I didn't allow myself to see was the fear behind his eyes, the hesitation in my mother's voice, the silent trust they were placing in me, their only child, to protect the one thing they had spent their entire lives building. And looking back now, after everything that followed, I understand something I refused to admit back then. That moment, right there at that table, was the first time I betrayed the two people who had never betrayed me. Though at the time I still believed I was doing the right thing. The business was Lauren's idea, though at the time I proudly told everyone it belonged to both of us, because believing that lie made me feel like a partner in something important instead of just the man financing her ambition with his family's sacrifices. The office she chose was in a renovated warehouse in downtown Columbus, the kind of place with exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, glass conference rooms, and a reception desk that made us look far more successful than we actually were. And I remember the day we signed the lease because Lauren walked through the empty space with this glowing confidence, pointing at corners and windows and saying things like, "This is where our empire begins." And I believed every word because loving someone sometimes makes you mistake their certainty for truth. At first, everything felt exciting. The branding meetings, the first hired employees, the late nights designing campaigns for small clients who were willing to take a chance on us. But excitement is expensive, and reality has a way of showing up faster than dreams expect. Within 3 months the numbers began slipping out of control. Vendors demanded payments earlier than projected, a client threatened legal action because a campaign launched 2 weeks late, and the fancy office we thought made us look credible turned out to be a monthly financial wound we couldn't stop bleeding. I started noticing things Lauren didn't want to talk about, like invoices that had been ignored or contracts she had signed promising services we didn't have the staff to deliver. But every time I tried to bring it up, she would shift the conversation somewhere else, usually toward how much pressure she was under or how our problems were being made worse by the negativity surrounding us. Eventually that negativity became my parents. She started saying the bank's hesitation on a second credit line had come from their reluctance when signing the collateral agreement, that their cautious attitude had made lenders nervous, that the energy around our launch had been poisoned by doubt, and at first I tried to argue that my parents had only wanted us to be careful. But Lauren had a way of turning conversations into emotional storms that left me exhausted and guilty for even questioning her. One night I came home to find her sitting on the kitchen floor surrounded by scattered papers and financial statements, crying so hard she could barely breathe, and she kept repeating that everything was collapsing, that she had sacrificed everything for this dream and now it was all falling apart because people didn't believe in her the way I did, and something about seeing her so broken made logic disappear from my mind completely. I didn't think about spreadsheets or bank balances anymore. I only thought about protecting the woman I had promised to stand beside. That was the night she first suggested we ask my parents for more help. She didn't say it aggressively, she said it softly, almost like she hated the idea herself. "Just a temporary cash infusion," she whispered. "Enough to stabilize things until the next big client signs." I remember hesitating because I knew my parents had already risked everything by putting their home on the line, but Lauren looked at me with tears still clinging to her eyelashes and said, "If they believe in you, they'll help you succeed." The way she said it made it sound like a test, not just of my parents' love, but of my own loyalty. So the next afternoon I drove to their house alone, rehearsing the conversation in my head like a speech I had to deliver perfectly. When my mother opened the door she immediately noticed something was wrong, because mothers always do, and she led me into the kitchen where my father was reading the newspaper with his glasses sliding down his nose. I explained the situation quickly, avoiding the parts that made the business sound unstable, focusing instead on the opportunity, the potential growth, the temporary nature of what we needed. When I finished, the kitchen went quiet except for the soft ticking of the wall clock. My mother looked at my father before speaking, and the sadness in her eyes made something inside me tighten with discomfort. "Honey," she said gently, "we already gave everything we could." My father folded the newspaper slowly and rested his hands on the table. "Son," he said, his voice calm but heavy, "your mother and I are retired. If something goes wrong again, we won't have time to rebuild." I wish I could tell you that I listened, that I respected their fear, but instead something dark took over me. Something fueled by pride, pressure, and Lauren's voice echoing in my head, and I started accusing them of things they didn't deserve. I told them they cared more about their savings than about my future. I told them they were sabotaging my marriage. I even said something I will regret for the rest of my life, that maybe Lauren was right about them never believing in me. My mother started crying quietly while my father sat there absorbing every word like a man being slowly dismantled by someone he loved, and when he tried to speak again, I didn't let him finish. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and walked out of that house while my mother was still calling my name from the doorway. For 3 months after that, I didn't call them. I convinced myself they needed to understand how serious the situation was, how important it was that they support us. Meanwhile, the business continued sinking beneath debt we could no longer control, and one Friday afternoon Lauren called an emergency meeting with our investors. I thought she was going to explain the financial problems honestly, maybe even ask for restructuring, but what happened instead is something I still struggle to process even now. 2 weeks later, a civil complaint was filed in county court accusing me of financial misconduct within the company. According to the documents Lauren submitted, I had mishandled funds, forged her signature on contracts, and hidden losses from our investors. Overnight, the narrative of our failing business transformed into something far worse. I was no longer just a struggling partner, I was the man responsible for destroying the company. And the cruelest part was hearing Lauren repeat the same line to anyone who asked about it, that she had tried to warn everyone about me from the beginning. You have no idea what it feels like to wake up one morning and realize your entire life has been rewritten by someone else's lies, because the day the news broke, I wasn't prepared for the speed of it, the violence of it, the way reputation can collapse faster than a building in an earthquake. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold when my phone started vibrating non-stop with messages, notifications, missed calls, and at first I thought something had happened to the business, maybe another angry client or an investor demanding answers, but when I opened the first message it was just a screenshot. My own face staring back at me from a local Columbus news website under a headline that said, "Marketing firm partner accused of embezzlement and fraud." For a moment, I genuinely thought it had to be some kind of mistake, some bizarre misunderstanding, because the article described me like I was a criminal mastermind who had secretly siphoned money from the company while manipulating my wife into silence, and the source quoted throughout the piece was none other than Lauren herself. I read the article 3 times before my hands started shaking, because every paragraph twisted reality in a way that sounded believable to anyone who didn't know the truth. According to the story, Lauren had been the hard-working visionary behind the agency while I had quietly sabotaged the finances, forged documents, hidden losses, and pressured her into signing contracts she didn't understand. Within hours the article spread everywhere: local blogs, community Facebook groups, LinkedIn threads where former colleagues debated whether they had always suspected something was off about me. And suddenly people who had once shaken my hand at networking events were commenting publicly about integrity and accountability like they had known my character all along. What hurt more than the headlines, though, was the silence from people I thought were my friends. Some simply stopped responding to my calls, while others sent short, awkward messages that felt more like condolences than support. And when I went to the grocery store that evening, a woman who used to chat with me in the produce aisle suddenly pretended to study a shelf of cereal like eye contact might infect her with scandal. But the real destruction didn't come from the news article, it came from the legal documents Lauren filed 2 days later. Her affidavit was over 40 pages long, and every single page felt like a knife sliding deeper into my chest because it wasn't just accusations about money, it was a complete reinvention of our entire relationship. In her version of the story, I had been emotionally manipulative from the beginning, isolating her from friends, pressuring her to make risky financial decisions, even threatening her when she questioned the business strategy, and the way she wrote it made me sound like a calculating predator who had slowly trapped her in a collapsing company. I remember sitting on the couch reading those pages late into the night, my eyes burning, because part of me kept hoping I would find some line where the real Lauren appeared again, the woman who once laughed with me in that downtown warehouse office and talked about building a future together. But she wasn't there anymore. The person speaking through those legal statements was someone who had decided I was expendable. That was the moment I finally realized I couldn't fight this alone, and for the first time in months, I thought about my parents. Not as obstacles or critics, but as the 2 people who had always stood beside me no matter how badly I messed things up. Shame made my stomach twist when I dialed their number, but I told myself none of that mattered now because I needed them. I needed to hear my mother's voice telling me everything would somehow be okay. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and then an automated message said the number had been disconnected. At first I thought it had to be a billing issue or maybe they had switched providers, but something in my chest tightened with dread, so I grabbed my keys and drove straight to the house I had grown up in, the same house where my parents had spent decades building a life from nothing. When I pulled onto the street, I immediately noticed something was wrong because the porch lights were off and the front yard looked neglected, the grass longer than my father ever allowed it to be, and as I walked toward the door I saw a bright orange notice taped to the wood, the kind banks use when they want the entire neighborhood to know what has happened. Foreclosure notice. The words felt unreal as I stared at them, like I was reading something meant for someone else's house, but the bank's logo at the bottom made everything painfully clear. Because the business had defaulted on its loans, the bank had exercised its rights against the collateral, my parents' home. The house they had finally paid off after 35 years of factory shifts, overtime weekends, and my mother cleaning empty office buildings at night. The house where every birthday, every Christmas, every childhood memory of mine had happened. I knocked on the door anyway, hoping somehow they were still inside, hoping maybe the notice was just paperwork that hadn't been enforced yet, but no one answered. I walked around the side of the house and peeked through the living room window, and the sight nearly made my knees give out because the place was empty, completely stripped of furniture, like the life that had once filled it had been erased. I stood there on that quiet porch for what felt like hours, listening to the wind push dead leaves across the driveway, realizing that while I had been busy defending Lauren, arguing with my parents, and chasing a dream that was never really mine, they had been losing everything. Their home. Their security. Their dignity. And the worst part wasn't just that it had happened, it was that I had caused it. I had chosen the wrong person to trust, the wrong person to defend, and in doing so I had destroyed the only 2 people who had never once turned their backs on me. And standing there staring at that foreclosure notice, with the neighborhood silent around me, one horrifying truth settled into my chest like a stone. I didn't even know where my parents were anymore. The day I saw my father begging was cold and gray, one of those miserable Ohio afternoons where the sky hangs low like a heavy blanket and a slow, relentless drizzle soaks through your clothes before you even realize it's raining. And I remember every detail of that day because it was the moment the last piece of my denial finally shattered. I had just walked out of the county courthouse after another brutal preliminary hearing where Lauren's attorney spent nearly 2 hours describing me as a manipulative fraud who had ruined his own company and emotionally abused the woman who trusted him, and sitting there while strangers listened to that version of my life felt like watching someone slowly erase the person I used to be, because every time the lawyer spoke, I could see people in the courtroom glancing at me with the same quiet judgment I had already grown used to over the past few weeks. When the hearing finally ended, I stepped outside into the drizzle, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and began walking toward the parking lot behind a strip mall across the street where I had left my car earlier that morning. My mind was spinning with everything that had just happened, the legal arguments, the whispered conversations in the hallway, the way Lauren avoided even looking at me as she walked past with her attorney, and I was so distracted that at first I barely noticed the small cluster of people standing near the entrance of a convenience store. It was a familiar sight in that part of town, a few homeless men sitting against the wall, a couple of shopping carts filled with plastic bags, someone holding a cardboard sign asking for help. Normally I would have walked past without really thinking about it, but something about one of the men caught my attention. He was standing slightly apart from the others, hunched beneath a torn blue poncho that barely protected him from the rain, holding a cardboard sign that read in uneven black letters, "Veteran. Need help. God bless." There was nothing unusual about the sign itself, but the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other felt strangely familiar, like a small movement I had seen 1,000 times before without ever realizing how deeply it had been burned into my memory. As I walked closer, my chest tightened for reasons I couldn't explain, and then the man slowly lifted his head. Our eyes met for just a fraction of a second, and the world stopped. Because the face staring back at me, thinner than I remembered, older, the skin around his eyes weathered and hollow, was my father's. For a moment neither of us moved. The rain kept falling, cars kept passing on the street, people kept walking in and out of the convenience store, but inside that tiny space between us everything froze. I saw recognition flash across his face almost immediately, a flicker of something painful and startled, but just as quickly he looked down at the ground, as if pretending not to know me would somehow protect us both from the humiliation of that moment. My stomach twisted so violently, I thought I might actually throw up right there on the sidewalk, because in that instant I understood something that no courtroom accusation could ever equal. While I had been fighting desperately to protect my reputation, my father had been fighting simply to survive. I stood there completely frozen, my mind screaming at me to run to him, to grab him, to apologize for every cruel word I had thrown at him months earlier in that kitchen, but my feet wouldn't move. Shame is a strange thing. It doesn't just hurt, it paralyzes you. I felt like if I walked toward him, everyone around us would instantly understand what kind of son I had been, what kind of man abandons the parents who sacrificed everything for him. And while I stood there trapped in that silent war inside my own head, a woman walking out of the convenience store paused beside my father, pulled a $5 bill from her purse, and gently placed it in his hand. "Hang in there, sir," she said softly before continuing to her car. I remember the kindness in her voice so clearly it still hurts to think about, because in that moment a complete stranger had shown my father more compassion than I had in months. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. Strangers were feeding my father. Strangers were encouraging him. Strangers were seeing his dignity when I had ignored it. Finally, forcing myself to breathe, I took one step toward him, then another, my entire body shaking with the weight of everything I needed to say. But by the time I reached the spot where he had been standing, he was already gone. I looked around frantically until I saw him walking slowly across the parking lot toward a cluster of tents hidden behind a row of dumpsters near the edge of the property, the kind of makeshift camp you see under highway bridges and abandoned lots, places where people disappear from the comfortable parts of society. I started after him, calling out "Dad" once, then again louder, but my voice sounded weak and broken even to my own ears. He never turned around. Maybe he didn't hear me. Maybe he chose not to. I stopped halfway across the parking lot as the rain soaked through my jacket, watching the silhouette of my father disappear into that cluster of torn tarps and plastic sheets, and in that moment something inside me finally collapsed completely. Because the lawsuits, the public accusations, the whispers about fraud and betrayal, none of that mattered anymore. The real damage, the unforgivable damage, had already been done months earlier when I chose someone else's voice over the two people who had loved me my entire life. And standing there alone in the rain, staring at the place where my father had just vanished, I realized that the worst punishment in the world isn't losing your reputation. It's realizing you deserve to. 2 weeks after the day I saw my father begging in the rain, Lauren delivered what would become the final blow to the life I once thought I had built, because that Monday morning, I received a notification from my lawyer telling me she had officially filed for divorce and requested an emergency protective order against me, claiming she feared retaliation and emotional harm if I attempted to contact her. And when I read those words on the legal document, I felt something hollow open inside my chest, because even after everything, the lawsuit, the accusations, the humiliation, I had still clung to the foolish belief that somewhere beneath all the lies there was still a piece of the woman I had loved, someone who might eventually tell the truth, someone who might admit things had simply spiraled out of control, but instead she chose the most brutal path possible, turning our entire marriage into a story where she was the victim, and I was the monster who had threatened her safety. The court granted the temporary protective order almost immediately, and just like that the walls around my life closed even tighter, because now the accusations weren't just financial anymore, they were personal and terrifying, the kind of claims that spread through social media faster than any explanation could ever catch up. And for days I watched strangers online discuss me like I was some dangerous criminal hiding behind a normal face, dissecting every detail of the case as if my life were a piece of entertainment. The next hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, and by the time that day arrived I had already accepted something painful. Even if the truth eventually surfaced, my reputation would never fully recover. Once people decide who you are, it's almost impossible to convince them otherwise. The courthouse hallway was crowded that morning with lawyers, reporters, and curious observers who had started following the story after the local news coverage, and as I sat on the wooden bench outside the courtroom waiting for my case to be called, I felt completely alone in a way I had never experienced before in my life, because every relationship I had relied on, my marriage, my business, my social circle, had collapsed in the same violent storm. When the courtroom doors opened and people began filing inside, I kept my head down, trying to avoid the curious stares, until something unexpected made me look up. My mother was standing in the doorway. For a moment, I genuinely thought my mind was playing tricks on me, because the last time I had seen her she was crying in the kitchen of the house I had helped destroy. But there she was, smaller than I remembered, yet somehow standing straighter than I deserved, wearing the same gentle expression she had always carried even when life treated her unfairly. Behind her walked my father, dressed in a suit that clearly didn't belong to him, the sleeves slightly too long and the jacket hanging loose on his shoulders like something borrowed from a donation rack. But his posture carried a quiet dignity that made my throat tighten immediately. And they weren't alone. Walking behind them were two men I hadn't spoken to in years. My childhood friends Marcus and Daniel, people I had pushed away early in my marriage because Lauren insisted they were bad influences who didn't understand our ambitions. Seeing them standing beside my parents felt surreal, like fragments of my old life suddenly appearing in a place where I expected nothing but judgment. When the hearing began, Lauren's attorney started confidently presenting the same narrative he had repeated for weeks, that I had financially manipulated the company, intimidated Lauren when she questioned my actions, and posed a continuing emotional threat. But halfway through his argument, my father quietly stood up. My lawyer handed the judge a thick folder of documents that Marcus and Daniel had helped gather over the past several months, and as those papers were examined in the courtroom, something extraordinary began to happen. Inside that folder were emails Lauren had sent privately to investors discussing how she planned to restructure company finances without informing me, internal messages where she admitted the agency was failing because of her own decisions, and even voice recordings where she calmly explained to a colleague that if the business collapsed, she could shift responsibility onto Jason because he signed most of the public-facing documents. The room fell silent as the evidence unfolded piece by piece. The confident expression on Lauren's face slowly disappeared, replaced by a tight, controlled tension that told everyone watching that the story she had been telling was no longer holding together. When the judge finally spoke, his voice carried a firmness that seemed to echo through the entire courtroom. The protective order was dismissed due to lack of credible evidence, and the civil accusations against me would require significant revision in light of the newly presented documentation. It wasn't a dramatic victory. There was no applause, no sudden redemption, but the narrative that had nearly destroyed my life finally cracked open just enough for the truth to breathe. Outside the courthouse, reporters tried shouting questions, but I barely heard them because my entire focus was on the two people standing quietly beside the courthouse steps. My parents. The same parents I had abandoned, insulted, and blamed for problems they had never caused. My legs gave out before I even realized what was happening, and I collapsed in front of them right there on the concrete, sobbing in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child, every ounce of shame and regret pouring out of me as I tried to explain how wrong I had been, how I had chosen the wrong person, how I had defended lies while pushing away the only people who truly loved me. I kept repeating the same words over and over. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. For a moment there was only silence. Then my father, the same man I had watched begging for coins in the rain, bent down and lifted me to my feet with his rough, familiar hands. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a love I had spent years taking for granted. "You're still my son," he said simply. And in that moment, I understood the truth that had taken me nearly 4 decades to learn. The people I rejected had never rejected me, and the pain I suffered wasn't some cruel accident of fate. It was the consequence of my own blindness, my pride, and the terrible mistake of believing loyalty belonged to the person who demanded it the loudest instead of the ones who had quietly given it my entire life. I didn't share this story for sympathy, and I didn't tell it to make myself look like a victim. I'm telling it because I was the one who made the biggest mistake a son can make. I want this story to reach the people who still have their parents but don't value them. The ones who ignore their calls, disrespect their sacrifices, or think there will always be more time. Because one day, you might wake up like I did, realizing the people who loved you the most were the ones you hurt the worst. If my story can stop even one person from making the same mistake I made, if it makes even one son or daughter hug their parents a little tighter tonight, then maybe my pain, my shame, and my regret won't be completely meaningless. I chose the voice that praised me, and ignored the voices that raised me. I defended the person who destroyed my life, and abandoned the 2 people who built it. By the time I finally saw the truth, my father was standing in the rain with a cardboard sign, and my mother was crying for a son who no longer acted like one. If you still have parents who love you, don't wait until their hearts break to realize their value. Because sometimes the greatest tragedy in life is understanding your mistake only after the damage can never be undone. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and comment below. And if you want to see more powerful stories like this, or even have your own story featured, make sure to subscribe to Betrayed by Blood. Because sometimes the most painful confessions are the ones that save someone else.